Good morning, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our Facebook Live. I would firstly like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we meet, the various lands on which we meet today, and pay my respects to the elders past, present, and emerging. My name is Di Macleod and I am the Director of Gold Coast Centre Against Sexual Violence, and October is Sexual Violence Awareness Month, as you will all know by now. The campaign that we've been running for the month is a continuation of the campaign that we launched last year, which is Start by Believing, based on the simple tenet: if someone tells you that they have been sexually abused, if you start by believing, that's a really important step in supporting the survivor and starting their healing journey. So in October, we usually have quite a lot of different events, and of course they have been different events this October. Most of our events in the past have been in person. So really we have had nothing much in person this year. October 2020 is the year of Zoom and Skype and Facebook Live and all the online things, which is exciting. It's a challenge, but very exciting. So during the month, we've had Thursday speak out sessions, which are our weekly feature for the month. And there's other activities for the rest of the month that I'll talk to you about at the end. But today, our speak out is around strangulation, which is a fairly new subject that workers have been finding their way around in the last few years. I'm just going to introduce Betty, and I'll read from her. I'll read an abridged version of her introduction. Most of you probably know her from working in the domestic violence and the violence against women sector for the past 28 years. Betty was the founding manager of Gold Coast Domestic Violence Prevention Centre and oversaw the development of the Gold Coast Domestic Violence Integrated Response. She chaired the Queensland Domestic Violence Council for 2 terms and has been an active member of the Domestic Violence Death Review Action Group since its formation in 2004. Betty has written several training manuals, including content material for the accredited course in responding to domestic and family violence. She also wrote Dying to be Heard, a discussion paper looking at domestic violence death reviews. Betty was awarded the Churchill Fellowship and Centenary Medal in recognition of her work in domestic violence intervention and prevention, and in fact has a whole bunch of accolades and awards that would take me the 30 minutes to read. But a recent really important one is the prestigious Queensland Great Award, and it's acknowledged that it's not many people get that, only a few people each year. So Betty was one of 6 this year that got that award. Congratulations from all of us. Betty's currently a member of the Domestic Violence Death Review Board, and she is the CEO of the Red Rose Foundation. So I will hand over to Betty and ask, first of all, if you can tell us a little bit about the Red Rose Foundation.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you, Di, and thank you for the invitation to be part of these speak out sessions, a wonderful way to get different messages out there. The Red Rose Foundation was formed in 2016, so it's relatively new, but its work's not new. It came out of what was previously known as the Queensland Domestic and Family Violence Death Review Action Group. So it goes back to work that came out of the Churchill Fellowship in 2002. Looking at the 2 primary things that we were campaigning and lobbying for was a standalone strangulation legislation and the establishment of a Domestic Violence Death Review Board. Both of those were recommendations in Not Now, Not Ever, and came to being in the reform that followed that. But however, as we know, the homicides haven't stopped, the our knowledge about strangulation needs to be continuing in what we're doing. So we formed the Red Rose Foundation to progress that work and to build on what we had done before.
And I guess that to begin with, it would be really good if you could give us a definition of strangulation and look at how that might differ from choking and why it's so dangerous.
Okay. There's two things about definition, and I want to put out one of the things that we've been, I guess, lobbying for ever since the legislation came in 2015 was for a legal definition in the Act. And it's not there, and not having that definition is causing a lot of problems in the legal arena, which I'll expand on a bit later. But the legal definitions that are being put forward in Queensland is about the cessation of breath, where in fact it's the interruption of both blood flow and oxygen to the brain. And they can cause different problems for victims, but the blood flow has potentially going to be the most lethal. And the work we're doing with survivors of strangulation, we're finding that vascular injuries is the most predominant. The cessation of breath to the brain can cause an anoxic brain injury, where the brain's starved of oxygen for any amount of time, there will be a brain injury. Strangulation, we know from the research in America, is one of the most lethal forms of violence, that women who've been strangled are 800 times more likely to eventually be a victim of homicide. It's acknowledged, and we even heard on our webinar this morning, even police acknowledge it's a gendered crime. 98% of the victims of non-lethal strangulation are women. So in terms of the definition, there's no legal definition in our Act, and we're one of the few jurisdictions that I know of that doesn't have that. Every other jurisdiction that's introduced legislation, it's defined by law.
And I guess that, impacts people's safety if we're only looking at one aspect of strangulation and not looking at it as the whole medical issue of what strangulation looks like. Do you want to just clarify for the audience the difference between strangulation and choking?
Yeah, sure. So women will often talk about, if you ask them, oh, he tried to choke me or he choked me, and people will regularly use the term choking, where choking is something that's external, that's put into your mouth. We often think about a fishbone, but it can be anything, but it is external, and that's the correct terminology for choking. Strangulation is something that's done to you and causing internal injuries from pressure to the throat or the neck, both those areas from pressure, either by most of the strangulation that we would see is what's termed manual, where someone's putting their hands around the throat or neck. That can be two hands to the front, a hand to the side, or two hands to even the back of the neck, and applying pressure. It can be ligature with jewellery, scarves, telephone cord, any of those things. And interesting, we had a webinar this morning with a noted pediatrician from the US that is a child abuse pediatrician, and talking about strangulation of children, and the predominant weapon, for want of a better word, actually is the children's own clothing. So as opposed to what we would see with women, grabbing children by hoodies or the collars of shirts and T-shirts. And But the other is what is the carotid restraint that we often know occurs in police training and martial arts, where it's the force from the elbow. It can be, knees, it can be feet, but it's any pressure at all. It doesn't have to be hands to the neck or throat. And the last is a form of strangulation or suffocation that is picked up in to the forefront now. It's in the legal code of Hawaii. It's called mechanical strangulation, where someone can stop a person's breathing just by sitting on their chest and applying pressure by sitting on their chest. All lethal forms of violence.
It's so it's just so serious, and I don't think people realise the extent of the definition and the extent of the behaviour that. And clearly, Red Rose Foundation is seeing victim survivors of strangulation, and they're contacting your organisation on a regular basis. You would have seen a range of people from all of those kinds of strangulation methods.
Yes, and you're right, Di, that we continue to learn ourselves, and we learn from the limited research out there, but we're learning so much from the women themselves. And once we saw strangulation as an event, reported to the police, he strangled me last night. Are there charges? Did you go to hospital? And we saw it as a one-off event impacting on a women. But the women now that are coming to us and part of our strangulation survivor group, they're experiencing the impact of strangulation months later. We're currently supporting a woman who 10 months after the strangulation, the jugular veins collapsed. They're finding now that from that strangulation event that wasn't picked up at the time, that she's got a fracture in her neck, that she's now needing some emergency surgery, on presentation to a medical facility after the jugular vein collapsed. She had very slurred speech. She couldn't walk properly. And, there was an assumption made, I think, about her appearance that they wanted to dismiss it as drugs. So despite what she was saying, they tested her for drugs. When that came back clear, she was hospitalised. If it hadn't have come back, I don't know. I think they would have let her go, and she probably could have died if she'd have had anything in the blood, that they hadn't taken the impact of the strangulation into account. Specialists are now telling her that night that she was presenting at a medical facility. She was in the process of having a stroke. All the symptoms of the stroke were there, but not seeing that a healthy woman who had not presented around anything prior. She was a young woman, so I guess the possibility of a stroke just didn't enter their mind.
And I guess that's one of the important takeaway messages, is around the necessity to be examined by a medical practitioner if you have experienced strangulation, ideally as soon as possible to the crime occurring, but also it would be worth seeking medical attention down the track to identify a range of issues. Can you talk a bit about the longer term? You've talked about stroke, the longer term medical effects that have been seen in strangulation victims?
Yes, sure. So it's important that they get to a medical facility, even if they're not talking about any symptoms at all, that they can be there. But sometimes initially they may be mild. It might be headaches, talking about a sore throat, talking about dizziness. But sometimes the impact of strangulation doesn't manifest itself properly for months later, can be anywhere 6 to 12 months. As I said, this woman's 10 months out from the strangulation itself. Just in the group that we have, women have various health issues impacting on them, vocal cord dysfunction. One has very diminished sight in one eye, neck and shoulder injuries, and I guess a range of injuries. And the importance is, if you have clients that have experienced strangulation and they get the medical checks and they're saying they're fine, and if you're checking in with them months later how they're going and they talk about, I guess, any injuries above the shoulders, really, they need to go back and get tested again. Often the one test isn't enough. It needs to be continually monitored. The other thing that we're finding with the women is the impact, I guess, from the strangulation event on them, both in terms of brain injury, the blockage of the oxygen to the brain, and an anoxic brain injury is making life really difficult for them. They have huge memory loss of memory in a lot of areas that never comes back, very diminished concentration. Often that's getting diagnosed as PTSD, and they are suffering from trauma related to that event, but some of them, it is so much more. That many of the women in the group are from professional backgrounds. They had careers, they had full-time work, and some of them now cannot go back to work. They can't. One woman's been off work for over a year, and people are not understanding that. You look okay, you sound okay, so you must be okay. And so some of it is about dealing with the trauma of how close to death they've come, that, they have someone that has said to them, I can kill you. And they're living with that. So they're waking up with nightmares and, tremors around all sorts of things. But the other is that blockage of the memory and the impact it has. And particularly for women who are making statements to the police and are going to proceed with criminal charges, that some of that memory doesn't come back, some of it comes back, but not in a linear fashion. That, giving a statement after strangulation is not a one-off event. It may be a process as memory comes back, that they want to go and not have police say to them, "Oh, you're going to change. Are you changing your statement?" Or this is different to what you originally told us. But it's not that what we told you at the first interview was right. Now we just want to be adding to that. And I think that is so important if women are going to proceed with the criminal charges.
Indeed, it's such far-reaching consequences, and I guess you alluded a bit to the legislation before. So our Queensland legislation on non-fatal strangulation is around people in a domestic setting, but regardless of who has strangled you, whether it's a child or a partner that doesn't, fit the definition of the legislation, that it is really important to get that medical treatment. And is the CT angiogram, is that what is still considered the kind of litmus test, the best thing post-strangulation?
The CT angiogram is the gold standard in assessment, or a CT, and it works its ways down. The problem that we've found is any women in remote rural contacting us, they may not even have that. So while that's certainly the gold standard, in places where it's not there, the going with, a normal scan or something has to take its place. But the main thing is it gets checked, it gets documented, and there is an ongoing, I guess, plan to be able to support and treat women. Just want to make a comment about the legislation. The other aspect of the legislation has, yes, certainly it relates to domestic and family violence relationships as defined by the Domestic and Family Violence Protection Act. When that legislation came in, there was opposition from some groups that may have seen strangulation as part of erotic sexual behaviour, and there was opposition to that act coming in. What was put into the act that we also want removed is consent. So the act talks about acts of strangulation. It does mention choking, which it shouldn't, and smothering. But it does say that these behaviours occurred without the consent. Our arguments now are that you can't consent to something that could possibly kill you. If someone if it's consensual sex, it doesn't mean that consenting to sex is implied consenting to strangulation. We need to be really clear about that it can occur it is occurring in relationships, and people are consenting to strangulation, and it still could kill them. It could kill them, months and months later. So we want that consent removed. And in saying that, been horrified to read where rough sex gone wrong is the biggest offence of the murder of women in intimate relationships in the UK.
Yeah.
Where the men are saying, she consented to sex, we're engaged in rough sex, and too bad that she died. Too bad that the bathrobe cord was too tight. So the UK government now has outlawed the use of that as a defence, that it can no longer be used. So we're saying here in Queensland in our legislation, consent has to be removed. It's not informed consent. If they don't know, it could kill them.
Absolutely. And I guess regardless of the situation that someone might be strangled, it is important for them to seek medical attention, and they can still report to the police. They might not be able to proceed under the strangulation legislation, but certainly assault occasioning bodily harm, grievous bodily harm, alternatives to if you were strangled by someone other than your intimate partner. So, I think the health consequences and holding people accountable. I mean, attempted murder is also a possible charge when you're engaging in a behaviour that could kill someone, intentional or not. Yeah.
And actually, outside of most of the strangulation that's occurring, as I said, it's gendered, it's about women in intimate relationships. The police have had over 3,000 charges, but that said, the Act has an upper limit of 7 years, but the average is 1.9. So if there were other, avenues for charges like grievous bodily harm or attempted murder, they would be getting a whole lot more, like 1.9 average, and we're seeing so many leaving the court with no conviction recorded on such dangerous behaviour, walking out of the courts with no conviction recorded.
Absolutely. And I guess Red Rose Foundation has been doing a lot of lobbying around legislative reform and doing education and awareness around strangulation. As we begin to wrap this up, would you like to talk about any planned training or education that people listening today might be able to take part in beyond this session?
Yeah, we always love talking about our training. And we've probably done about 5 lots just in the last week. COVID's made it difficult, so most of them are online. And as a trainer, I hate that. I hate not being able to engage with people and, you know, have those conversations. But we will be doing a lot more training, particularly across the health and wellbeing services and the sexual assault services. We'll be developing a range of new resources for the community-based groups. The best way to stay linked with us is through our website. You know, just say you'd like to join our mailing list, or info@redrosefoundation.com.au. Early next year, we want to get back to some face-to-face training programs, but we will continue online, and we'll continue the development of resources to get them out to people. So love to hear from people that want to be engaged with us.
As you're speaking, the email address and the website are scrolling along the bottom of the screen for people to take note of. So look, thank you very much for joining us today and giving us some important information around strangulation for all workers, whether you're a community member or whether you're working in the field. It's something that we need to take really seriously. We need to look at the health consequences, as Betty has said, and we need to hold people accountable for perpetrating that behaviour. So we need to look at the criminal justice response as well. I'd just like to wrap up by looking at what else is planned for the month. We have a range of activities still to come. That we have an online scavenger hunt that's running at the moment through till the end of the week. We have an online trivia night this Friday night and a speak out next Thursday. So if people want to stay tuned through our Facebook and Instagram pages, there's resources and information there for you. So thank you again, Betty, and thank you to everyone who's joined us today. And we hope that you enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.
Thanks, Di. Thanks to the Gold Coast Centre Against Sexual Violence.